The Siege of Eger, in the year 1552, stands as one of the most unreal defensive wins, not just in Hungarian history, but across all of Europe's 16th century showdown with the Ottoman Empire. This was supposed to be quick, brutal, over in a matter of days. Instead, a fortress everyone had already written off refused to go down. Northern Hungary sat under heavy autumn skies as an Ottoman force, somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 soldiers rolled in. Cannons were positioned. War banners snapped in the wind. Confidence wasn't just high, it was absolute. This army believed momentum itself was on their side. Inside the walls of Eger, fewer than 2,000 defenders waited, not quietly, not hopelessly, but locked in, focused, ready. This wasn't a surprise strike or a lightning raid like earlier Ottoman victories. This was a full siege, slow, methodical, relentless, the kind designed to crush morale before it crushed stone. And yet, Eger did not fall. So how did an outdated, aging fortress throw a wrench into the advance of one of the most powerful empires on earth? To answer that, we have to zoom out, because Eger didn't stand alone. It stood inside a Europe already cracking under pressure. That pressure exploded in the year 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs. In a single afternoon, the medieval kingdom of Hungary collapsed. King Louis II drowned while retreating through marshland. The royal army shattered, and with it vanished the political core that had held Hungary together for centuries. What followed wasn't recovery, it was dismemberment. Hungary was carved into three parts. The Central Plains fell directly under Ottoman rule. The western and northern regions slid into Habsburg control, and between them stretched a violent frontier zone, unstable, over-fortified, and constantly bleeding. This border wasn't just a line on a map, it was an open wound. By the year 1541, the Ottomans captured Buda, the old Hungarian capital. Ottoman records from the time don't describe this as simple conquest, but as consolidation, a permanent foothold north of the Balkans. From that moment on, Ottoman strategy became crystal clear. This empire didn't move on impulse. Modern historians digging through tax records, military letters, and logistics reports all point to the same pattern. The Ottomans advanced through fortress chains. They didn't skip strongholds. They swallowed them. Rivers were locked down. Supply routes secured. Only then did the army push forward. Under that logic, northern Hungary wasn't some side quest. It was critical. Eger sat right at the hinge of this entire plan. The fortress guarded mountain passes leading into Upper Hungary and deeper toward Habsburg territory. Even more important, it protected internal routes that linked Vienna to the eastern defensive network. If Eger fell, that northern chain would snap. Vienna wouldn't fall overnight, but it would suddenly be closer to the front, more isolated, and way more exposed. This wasn't paranoia. Letters preserved in Viennese archives from the late 1540s and early 1550s spell it out clearly. Officials weren't talking about distant threats. They were talking about timing, about how long the line could hold, about how little room for error remained. That anxiety shaped the campaign of 1552. For the Ottoman High Command, this year was supposed to be decisive. Multiple fortresses were hit one after another. Temesvar fell. Szolnok followed. Others surrendered with barely a fight. Everything pointed toward inevitability. Against that backdrop, Eger looked almost pointless. Its walls were medieval, not modern Italian-style defenses. The garrison was small. Supplies were thin. Ottoman chroniclers and Habsburg observers both agreed on one thing. Eger wasn't expected to win. It was expected to stall. The real question wasn't if the fortress would fall. It was when. And that assumption came from a massive misread of the moment. Because Eger wasn't just stone and mortar. It was a psychological threshold. If it collapsed fast, the idea of resistance in northern Hungary would collapse with it. But if it held, even for a short time, the entire narrative would crack. Fear would hesitate. Confidence would wobble. That was the invisible pressure bearing down on Eger's walls. And when the Ottoman army finally surrounded the hill in the autumn of 1552, history leaned forward, watching. The Ottomans didn't arrive careless, but the fortress didn't sit blind either. Inside the walls, preparation had begun long before the first cannon ever fired. The garrison numbered fewer than 2,000 men. They weren't a field army built for open battle, but they were exactly what this moment demanded. The people inside Eger weren't just soldiers. They were town guards, craftsmen, families, and locals who made a choice to stay when escape was still possible. This wasn't an army dropped in from the outside. This was a community that decided together that they weren't running. Command rested with István Dobo, appointed captain earlier that same year. Hungarian sources from the time don't paint him as a loud man or a dramatic one. No big speeches, no ego, just structure, discipline, control. Dobo knew siege warfare for what it really was. Stone alone doesn't hold a fortress. Endurance does. The gates were sealed. All positions were assigned, then reassigned. Supplies were pulled in, counted, locked down, and guarded like gold. Every day followed the same brutal rhythm. Reinforce, recheck, repeat. Walls were thickened where possible, packed with earth and rubble to absorb impact. Timber braces were driven in behind weak points. Old towers were converted into firing platforms. Courtyards were cleared so defenders could move under fire without choking the interior. But not all of Eger's preparation was built from wood and stone. Working quietly in the shadows of the fortress was Gurgely Bornemissa. He didn't command men, he commanded devices. Self-taught, sharpened by experience rather than formal schooling, Bornemissa understood fire, pressure, and controlled destruction in a way few others did. Hungarian accounts written decades after the siege describe his work carefully, almost nervously, as if even the writers knew they were stepping outside the rules of conventional warfare. In makeshift workshops, mixtures were tested, containers were sealed, fuses were measured through trial, failure, and near disaster. These weren't standard weapons, they were experimental, volatile, dangerous even to the hands that built them. Bornemissa didn't promise miracles. He prepared possibilities. His creations weren't meant for open battle. They were meant for the moment when walls broke, when numbers overwhelmed, when the fight turned close, chaotic, and personal. This preparation stayed quiet. No banners, no announcements, no heroic speeches. Inside Eger, information was kept tight. Everyone knew their job and almost nothing beyond it. Modern historians studying written records and physical remains believe this was intentional. Surprise, not spectacle, was the goal. As the Ottoman camp spread across the surrounding hills, as gun platforms were leveled and trenches began to bite into the earth, the defenders of Eger weren't preparing for victory or rescue, they were preparing for disruption. The siege began the way sieges always did, with fire, uncertainty, autumn, and artillery opened in disciplined sequence. Cannons targeted towers, smashed parapets, and tried to expose the fortress from the inside out. This wasn't chaos. This was experience at work. From dawn to dusk, the valley shook with thunder, stone cracked, mortar turned to dust. Entire sections of walls sagged outward under repeated impact. By the logic of 16th century warfare, the result looked inevitable. Eger should have fallen. But every night, when the guns went quiet and smoke drifted away, the fortress refused to die. Under torchlight, broken masonry was cleared. Breaches were stuffed with earth, timber, and rubble, torn from inside the fortress itself. Where stone failed, wood rose. Where wood shattered, soil absorbed the blast. Centuries later, archaeological layers would confirm this rhythm. Destruction pressed directly against repair, compressed into weeks. What artillery destroyed by day, human labor reclaimed by night. As the bombardment dragged on, Ottoman engineers pushed forward. Trenches crept closer. Saps advanced under covering fire. Timber frames were assembled for mining operations meant to collapse foundations already weakened by cannon shot. The defenders didn't answer with flashy counterattacks. They answered with interference. Hungarian chronicles and Habsburg reports describe sudden sorties at first light. Short, violent, purposeful. Just enough to disrupt digging, burn materials, and vanish back behind the walls before the Ottomans could respond. Eger wasn't trying to win fast. It was trying to survive long enough to change the story. These weren't long battles. They were short, violent bursts, just enough to torch tools, collapse earthworks, and vanish before the Ottomans could lock the defenders down. No single strike decided anything, but together they slowed the machine, and in siege warfare, slowing the machine is everything. Once the walls were torn open enough, the real test began. The assaults came. Ottoman infantry pushed forward under covering fire. Ladders slammed against shattered stone. By every military handbook of the 16th century, this was supposed to be the breaking point. The moment when defenders cracked. Inside Eger they didn't. The fight collapsed into arm's-length chaos. No formations, no banners, no clean lines. Men fought from behind makeshift barricades, from doorways hacked straight into the walls, from stairwells carved deep into the rock. Contemporary witnesses describe crush and confusion. Bodies jammed together, footing uncertain. Steel rang on steel. Men slipped on rubble slick with rain and blood. The line bent, but it did not break. And then, in the middle of smoke and noise, something unfamiliar entered the fight. From inside the fortress, weapons prepared in secrecy were dragged forward. Sealed containers, weighted vessels, hand-cut fuses. This was the work of Gurgely Bornemisa. These weren't standard weapons of the age. They were improvised engines of fire and pressure, early explosive devices built not for elegance but for raw effect. Thrown into packed assault formations, they didn't just wound. They shattered cohesion. Ottoman chroniclers later wrote of sudden flame, choking smoke, and confusion so thick men couldn't see who stood beside them. Hungarian tradition would later hype these moments, but the core truth stands untouched. The defenders unleashed a kind of warfare the besiegers had not prepared for. The psychological shock hit instantly. Assault troops hesitated. Spacing collapsed. Momentum stalled. Then, right at the peak of the struggle, the battlefield itself turned. The wind shifted. What had been a steady current twisted, pushing smoke and flame back toward the attackers. Fire that should have died against stone rolled outward. Instead. Heat surged. Smoke thickened. This wasn't planned. It couldn't be commanded. But it was seized. Bornemisa's devices, released at that exact moment, hit harder. Flames carried farther. Smoke lingered longer. Confusion deepened into panic. Modern historians are careful not to call this a miracle. The wind didn't win the battle by itself. But in siege warfare, tiny physical changes at the worst possible moment can flip the script. And this was one of those moments. Assault after assault failed. Not with one massive repulse, but through exhaustion. Eger didn't break the Ottomans with a knockout punch. It drained them. Casualties rose, not catastrophically, but steadily. Supply lines stretched. Fatigue spread. Confidence bled away. Ottoman siege doctrine assumed forward momentum. The slow tightening of the noose. At Eger that logic collapsed. Days passed, then weeks. The defenders were wounded, reduced and exhausted, yet still standing on the walls. Sources from the Times split in tone. Ottoman writers downplayed the setback, framing withdrawal as a smart decision. Habsburg observers wrote in disbelief that a fortress expected to fall in days was still standing. What never changed was the outcome. The assault stopped. The guns went quiet. In the autumn of 1552, Ottoman commanders ordered a withdrawal, not because Eger was unbreakable, but because time, the most important weapon in siege warfare, had failed them. And in that failure, a small fortress rewrote history. Eger was still standing. When the Ottoman camps were broken down and the guns pulled away, the silence that followed felt almost unreal. After weeks of thunder and fire, quiet hit harder than noise ever had. Eger was still standing, but barely. The fortress was almost unrecognizable. Walls were shattered, scorched black, and patched with earth and timber where stone had ailed. The defenders were exhausted, wounded, fewer than when the siege began. What remained wasn't celebration. It was survival. Strategically, the war didn't end at Eger. Hungary stayed divided, the Ottoman-Habsburg frontier remained unstable, and the empire that withdrew would return one day, stronger, smarter, and in greater force. But in the year 1552, something very real had been achieved. The northern advance had been stopped. Letters preserved in Viennese archives from the months after the siege make that clear. Officials didn't write with victory songs, they wrote with relief. Eger hadn't delivered triumph. It had delivered time. Time to reinforce other frontier fortresses, time to rethink defensive strategy, time to absorb a lesson no one had expected to learn. From the Ottoman side, the withdrawal was framed as caution. Chroniclers pointed to rising costs and the need to preserve strength for future campaigns. There was no admission of defeat. But the resistance at Eger wasn't brushed aside either. What the siege revealed was uncomfortable. The fortress hadn't held because of walls alone, not because of numbers, It held because the rules were bent. Improvised explosives, fire-based weapons, sudden countermeasures that shattered the rhythm of a textbook siege. Combined with unpredictable natural conditions, they exposed a weakness not in strength, but in assumption. Modern historians are careful here. Eger didn't revolutionize warfare, but it proved something powerful. Technical creativity and local adaptation could blunt even the most experienced siege machine. In the math of empire, that mattered. The Ottomans withdrew not because they were beaten in open battle, but because the cost of continuing outweighed the certainty of success. Time, resources, and momentum were drained away. And momentum, once lost, is brutal to reclaim. Eger didn't flip the balance of power in Europe. The Ottoman Empire endured. Hungary remained divided, and decades later the fortress itself would fall. Yet the siege of 1552 refused to fade. It endured because it revealed something fundamental about war itself. Early chroniclers recorded the facts calmly. Later generations wrapped the story in legend. Modern historians stand in between, separating evidence from exaggeration, and still the meaning holds. Eger wasn't saved by walls alone, not by numbers, not by luck. It held because preparation created opportunity. Gurgely-born Emissa didn't defeat an empire, but his work showed how technical ingenuity could crack expectations, how weapons built under pressure could disrupt a superior force. The changing wind didn't win the siege, but it exposed a truth as old as warfare itself. Nature doesn't pick sides, but it favors those who are ready when conditions shift. That is the legacy of Eger, not blind heroism, not a miracle without cause, but the collision of discipline, creativity, and timing. Military history loves decisive victories and final outcomes. Eger reminds us that history is also shaped by moments when collapse was expected and didn't happen. Moments when endurance stalled momentum, when resistance bought time, when preparation turned uncertainty into advantage. That's why Eger still matters. If this story hit you, share it, because history isn't written only by empires that advance, but by those who know when to hold the line and how to endure until the moment changes.